"Get the gun!" I screamed at Charlie. Charlie looked down at Sloane with slow comprehension dawning in his face. He took one massive sneaker and stomped down on Sloane's right hand with the pistol in it. I heard the bone crack like twigs snapping. Sloane shrieked, trying to pull away, but Charlie continued leaning down on his arm, preventing him from moving it. The fire was creeping at an incredible rate, rising up the walls and across the ceiling. Thick, black smoke filled the room, suffocating. I ran at Charlie, my eyes watering. I realized I was still holding the meat cleaver in one hand. I looked down at Sloane in his suit of human skin, still trying to raise the gun with his broken arm. I wanted to finish this quickly. I brought the knife down into the back of his neck, hearing the bone crack. There was a wet thud and a bubbling of blood as the meat cleaver bit deeply into through his spine, and then Sloane was still. "Come on, Charlie," I said, grabbing his large hand. He wrapped his fingers around mine. Coughing and choking, we stumbled out into the night as police cars started pulling up. The first one had Sergeant Alvarez in it, who ran towards us, helping a stumbling Charlie toward the back seat of her car, where he could sit down and catch his breath. Both houses were on fire now, blazing pillars of flame that rose high into the black, starless sky. At that moment, I only hoped that the flames would eat away the corpse of Sloane's mother, the bone-faced woman. I also wondered about the owners of grimy basement bars, who would suddenly turn out their neon signs, shutter their windows, and lock their doors with clients inside, only to reopen their doors half an hour later. I wondered about the grotesque sculptures I had started to find in abandoned lots in the neighborhood, made of discarded animal parts. One was made up of the severed head of a dead dog, the ripped-off wings of a crow, and the body of a nude plastic baby doll. In another, the intestines of some large animal dangled from the head of a supermarket mannequin, like some ghastly interpretation of a snake. Whatever they meant, they hadn't happened by accident. Something was happening in the neighborhood, and as time passed, discovering what it was became almost as important to me as the grim end that I had come looking for. I wanted to know why bands of cold-eyed young men would suddenly cross the street beside the empty park, as though scared by their own shadows. I wanted to know why, no matter how empty the streets there appeared to be, I always had the feeling that I was being followed. I never saw anyone, not exactly, but I was sure that out there, in the abyss between the streetlights, something horrible was lurking. My fantasies had involved being stabbed in a knife fight, or sentenced to life in prison after beating some drug dealer to death, not of whatever it might do to me. As the days grew colder and shorter, I began to realize that there were far worse things than death or jail. As much as I feared whatever haunted those streets, however, I was equally drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. Despite dumpster diving for food and the unpaid bills that kept piling up inside my mail slot, I felt more alive than I had in years. I was supposed to be dead by now, and yet, I had to know. The only problem was, my amateur investigation seemed to have reached a standstill. The vomit-splattered, piss-reeking drunks who I interrogated gave vague half-answers that not even the promise of cash could turn around. They knew more than they were telling. Feel it. No one wanted to acknowledge what was happening, but the fear in their eyes was obvious. Felt like I was beating my head against one of the crumbling, graffiti-covered factory walls, until the night I met the creator of those 6 sculptures. When I stumbled in on him, he was putting the finishing touches on his latest project, an opera mask stitched to the corpse of a dead raccoon, with the plastic hands of dozens of tiny toys sticking out from its rotted ribcage. He was trying to hang it from a light post. I shouted and moved toward him. He ran, making his construction crash with a splatter onto the pavement. He scrambled up a chain-link fence and vaulted into an overgrown lot. I pursued, tripping over shapeless lumps in the dark. The lot seemed like it had been some sort of dumping ground for a garage or factory. Whole cars rusted on concrete blocks beside heaps of unidentifiable junk. I was halfway across it before I realized that the slim figure in the navy blue hoodie that I was chasing had disappeared. I began to wonder whether following him into such an isolated place had been such a good idea after all. I had always imagined my death or arrest being on the evening news, my disappointed parents and alienated friends shaking their heads at fate. But here, my corpse would be feeding strays for weeks or years before anyone even noticed that I was missing. I peered around the heaps of junk, wondering where he could have gone. In the split second before the hunk of metal slammed into my chest, I identified it as an old fire extinguisher. Stars exploded in front of my eyes and I went down hard in the knee-high weeds, heard the crunch of decomposing wood and metal beneath my dead weight. Then suddenly, I was more than just stunned and hurting. I was angry. I got to my knees and rammed into my assailant. To my surprise, he went flying, crashing into the ground with a grunt. I flung myself on top of him, a loose hunk of concrete in my hand. His hood fell back as I lifted my improvised weapon. He was just a kid. Couldn't have been more than 14. Signs of abuse and mental illness covered his face, but what hurt the most was how he looked up at me. Like this was nothing unusual. Like this was more or less exactly how he'd expected to die. Puffing at a loss for words, I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. Making monsters, he told me, to protect us from the real one. I helped the boy to his feet. He said his name was Eli. During the day, his mother homeschooled him, so he didn't have to go to what he called the special room at the local public school, but she worked nights. And while she was gone, he climbed out the window to decorate the neighborhood with his creations. No one cares about us, Eli explained. When we go missing, people think it's normal. But it's not. He pulled a crumpled paper out of his pocket and jammed it into my hand. Then he was gone, slipping past me and into the night. He had given me a crumpled sheet of children's construction paper. 4 names and faces cut out from newspapers had been pasted to it. Marius Brown, Clayton Gaines, Chandra Witt, Rosalia Velasquez. As the sun came up that morning, I plugged them into a search engine. They were all people who'd gone missing in the neighborhood during the past year. I recognized one of them. Clayton Gaines was the terrified junkie that slammed into me as he ran from something that I couldn't see. The people who had vanished had little in common. Marius had been an amateur DJ, Chandra a hairdresser, and Rosalia a night shift security guard. The only thing the 4 of them shared was the fact that they had all disappeared in the same 6-block radius between 1-5 a.m. In any other area, those circumstances would have inspired a hunt for a serial killer. But crime was so commonplace in the neighborhood that the police had chosen to ignore the coincidences completely. Maybe it was obsession, or maybe it was simply lack of sleep. The priorities of my nightly walks were beginning to change. I no longer cared about entangling myself in a problem grave enough to end my disappointing existence. I wanted to know what was going on. The problem was, none of the night denizens of the neighborhood were willing to talk about it. The moment I mentioned one of the names, people turned away from me. I was cursed. Some got violent. When I asked a bouncer outside a seedy strip club if he'd seen anything unusual lately, he shoved me so hard I fell off the curb and hit my skull on the asphalt of a potholed street. With his "get the fuck out of here" still ringing in my ears, I pushed myself to my feet and staggered off. It hadn't been the fight I'd imagined, and I hadn't seen it coming. I had been hurt. Bad. When I touched the back of my head, my hand came away red. And that wasn't all. Felt lightheaded, dizzy, not even able to stick to the uneven sidewalks as I wandered down the foggy, deserted streets. At one point, glass shattered behind me. Someone had thrown a bottle. My vision swam. I could see another dark open space ahead, but this was no abandoned lot. It was a historically protected cemetery, ringed by a waist-high iron fence. Most of the tombstones had long since been defaced or kicked over, but something about the idea of silence and soft grass was suddenly hypnotically irresistible. I lurched over the fence to lay in the darkness behind the cemetery's storage shed. I could feel my heartbeat in my skull. taste the irony flavor of blood between my teeth. This was it. I had gotten what I'd wanted all along, an ignoble death in a forgotten part of town, only to discover that it wasn't at all like I had imagined. The world had begun to seem so vast, incredible, and strange, so worthy of being explored and appreciated. I passed out, but only for a few minutes. The cemetery was still dark when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had awoken me. Then the old drunk's sad, out-of-tune song reached me. He was wandering down the middle of the street in front of the cemetery in an eerie reenactment of what I had just been doing. But he wasn't alone. A woman was approaching him from the shadows of a boarded-up store on the corner. Lost in his own world, he didn't see her coming. Not even she was close enough to touch him. She stood behind the grizzled old man as he lowered his torn jeans to piss on a fire hydrant. It was the closeness that bothered me the most. The way she stood perfectly still, so near that the old drunk should have felt her breath on his neck. Oblivious, he pulled up his pants, mostly, and staggered back toward the street. He never made it that far. Because of my head injury, I can't swear that the next part happened exactly how I remember it. All I know is what I saw. The woman's neck seemed to stretch somehow, arching over her prey like a snake preparing to attack. Then she struck, chomping on the man's face and neck until he crumpled, lifeless, to the ground. With her teeth still embedded in his right cheek, and her neck still gruesomely extended several feet beyond its natural length, she began to drag him toward me. I pushed myself to my hands and knees, looking desperately for a place to hide. From behind a gnarled cypress tree, I watched as the woman pulled herself effortlessly over the fence. She was so close now that I could hear the slick, heavy sound of the old drunk's corpse sliding across the wet grass. Digging her bare fingers into the dirt, she began to dig. An ordinary person's fingers would have bent and broken, their nails peeling away from skin in bloody strips. Still, she dug on, clawing at the dirt like a rabid animal. A clump of still warm dirt splattered across my cheek as the pit she was digging grew deeper. The woman was below the surface by the time I realized what she was doing. She was going to bury the body. Just like this old man, the people who had disappeared would never leave this neighborhood. They were here, buried along with who knew how many others. The thought struck me just as the woman's head rose up from the hole she had dug. Just as before, her neck distorted gruesomely as it rose 2, 3, 6 feet above her body, searching for something. Her head coiled in circles through the damp night air like a serpent made of human skin. From where I crouched in the dead leaves of the cypress tree, a sound reached me. Sniffing. Could she smell me? My blood? My heartbeat? I began to creep backwards, as slowly and quietly as I dared. The cemetery was just a single city block in size. The short iron fence behind me felt miles away. In just 1 or 2 more sweeps of that hideous rope-like neck, the woman and I would be face to face, even though her body was still perched like a carrion bird in the shallow grave she'd just finished digging. As her head searched, her body dragged the drunk inside, its hands covering him methodically with dirt. I winced as my foot connected with the iron rails of the fence. The sound of digging stopped. The woman's body slithered up from the shallow grave it was digging, and her head froze in midair, staring straight at me. She moved faster than I would have ever thought possible. The spiked fence stabbed into my leg as I heaved myself over it and onto the sidewalk. I ignored the pain. The thinking part of my brain was no longer in control. Like a deer chased by wolves or a seal before the jaws of a shark, I was just another prey animal, fleeing from a predator. Still dizzy from my head injury, I weaved drunkenly, staggering as I fled. It was only a matter of time. I tripped on the uneven sidewalk and sprawled face first on the concrete. In the yellow glow of the streetlights, the shadow of the woman's stretched neck hung over me. Drool and gore from her last victim dribbled down, splattering on my face and shoulders. I think I screamed, but I couldn't have said for sure. Just before I shut my eyes to accept my fate, another monstrous shadow fell over. Its pale face was human, with butcher knives sticking out where the eyes should have been. Ragged strands of something black hung from its back, like a vile imitation of wings. It thrust itself at my attacker's hovering head, rattling like a pile of old bones. The woman paused, then retreated, backing away slowly into the night like the fading of a bad dream. I looked up at the new horror, noticing for the first time that it wasn't quite what it seemed. It wasn't moving on its own. In fact, it hung from the end of a long fiberglass pole, the sort custodians use to change light bulbs on high ceilings. At the end of the pole was a short figure covered by a black shroud. Even before he threw back the blanket that covered him, I knew who it was. Eli, with another one of his creepy creations. "I told you there were real monsters," Eli mumbled. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. The wind sighed through the twisted cypress trees of the cemetery. Whatever stalked the streets of the neighborhood was gone, now. I got a brief spot in a local newspaper for pointing out to the police where the bodies were buried, but after that, my life went back to normal. Except for one thing. My goals had changed. There was something more important to me than using a violent death to escape my problems. I wanted to see Eli succeed. I wanted to make sure that he made it out of the neighborhood, and that he got his art in front of people who would appreciate it. After all, he had saved me from 2 monsters that night, and one of them was myself.